Alright, I'm back, guys. And the Draper situation, uh, it was not the same as the Population Council, I believe. Although he was involved in stuff about population, I believe when I did research on the Draper event, or I forget what it was called, and the Population Council, it was obviously different in its rhetoric, I guess. Okay. After Bush's death in 1950, Moore, 1954, self-published a pamphlet titled "The Population Bomb," which popularized Bush's explosive view of population and updated human breeding and survival for the Cold War era. The first edition came out in 1954, and Moore frequently reused it over the next 15 years. Moore's population bomb described population growth in Africa, Asia, Latin America as leaving, leading inevitability to the spread of global communism and nuclear war, and called on the U.S. government to limit population growth in these parts of the world. It's a little weird that poor nations would just allow or come up just like it makes no sense that nuclear war would come out of that. Like you could blame ground war, like boots on the ground war, but straight up technological warfare, that's just, you can't blame that. Now, of course, the population bomb is symbolic. It's not saying that people, it's symbolic of the resources being wasted and sort of draining it dry, sort of like how a nuke sort of drains the area of life. With radiation, I guess. It's kind of more bleak than usual, I think, actually. Alright. Where the hell was I? Okay. Moore circulated the pamphlet throughout his wide social and professional network, securing the partnership of influential businessmen and diplomats. Best known among these partners was General William Henry Draper, Jr., chair of the 1958 committee charged by President Eisenhower with evaluating the U.S. military aid program directly influenced by Moore's population bomb. The Draper Commission included in its final report a recommendation that the United States add population limitation measures to its foreign policy. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Sheesh. Through the 1960s, more 1967, the Draper ran full-page ads in the country's major newspapers demanding that the U.S. government activity forestall population growth overseas. Even though most demographers never signed on to environmental Malthusianism, the Demographically Oriented Population Council collaborated with three Malthusian organizations: the Conservation Foundation, Planned Parenthood, and the PRB to stoke public anxiety about overpopulation. The council funded Planned Parenthood's efforts to develop contraceptive technologies that could be imposed on women in the global south, such as IUD, and helped secure funding for the PRB from the Ford Foundation. The leadership of the council and the PRB maintained back-channel communications while keeping the two organizations formally separate. These groups collaborated because their separate problematizations of population, economic, and environmental appeared to point to a common solution: nominally voluntary family planning programs that employed small family propaganda to promote uptake of the IUD. Hold on. A fragile but symbiotic relationship between environmental Malthusianism and demography emerged from this collaboration. Environmental Malthusianism generated public opinion favorable to demography and the Population Council's family planning programs, while demography provided tacit support to environmental Malthusianism by refraining from public critique. The council worked quietly at first, fearing that public attention to its overseas family planning activities would generate opposition, both in the United States and abroad. Its leaders soon found, however, that Vaux and Osborne's books, Moore's pamphlet, and Moore and Draper's advertising campaign softened public opinion toward family planning. Probably the most successful collaboration between the Council and the Malthusian organizations resulted in the publication of Population Growth and Economic Development in Low-Income Countries, a case study of India's prospects, known formally as the Cole-Hoover 1958 report after its authors, Princeton demographer Ainsley J. Cole, and CIA economist Edgar M. Hoover. Inspired by Moore's population bomb and funded by the World Bank, the Cole-Hoover report published the results of a simulation study finding that India's per capita national income over the next 30 years would be 40% higher if birth rates could be cut in half. Although the study's initial assumptions entirely determined its outcome, Moore and the PRB and the Population Council presented it to the U.S. government and the governments of developing countries worldwide as a definitive proof that continued high fertility is an impediment, if not a total barrier, to economic and social development. This study served for the next 30 years as empirical evidence that slowing population growth could spur economic development. No comparable study demonstrated that slowing population growth could protect the natural environment, but the Cole-Hoover report generated enough support for family planning to satisfy Moore, Hoover, and Draper and the Malthusian organizations for a while. I actually never knew about this, and from everything I've read just in physical form, I've never come across this specific... Okay. Well, there's a lot of institutions and market influences involved in this stuff in terms of attacking the third world. So I guess I'm not going to be able to come across everything at once, I suppose. Alright. With the Cole-Hoover report supposedly having established the necessity of reducing birth rates overseas, Demography's patrons turned the field's attention to research on how exactly to do that. Flush with funding generated by a public concern about overseas population growth, demography programs in U.S. universities recruited international students who were expected to return home and lobby for governmental family planning programs. American demographers also worked in the Global South, collaborating with Population Council to launch family planning programs under the guise of demographic research. In 1965, after the Population Council had funded a National Academy of Sciences 1963 panel that reiterated the results of the Cole-Hoover report without any further research, the U.S. government established an Office of Population within the U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. Aid, offering family planning assistance worldwide and funding non-governmental organizations that were already in the family planning business, beginning with the Population Council and Planned Parenthood. Okay, guys. So, in the comment section, just remind me to look up this Cole-Hoover report, because honestly, this is something I feel like I should have come across a while ago. And I think I've said that throughout my channel. Or maybe I've said it in person. I don't remember which. Okay. Working together, the Population Council and the Malthusian organizations had, by the late 1960s, generated the widespread perception, not just in the United States, but throughout much of the world, that human numbers were rising too quickly and that something needed to be done. This was, however, primarily a victory for demography and the Population Council, which largely controlled the terms of the solution to the perceived population problem. Before long, Moore and Draper grew frustrated with the slow results of the nominally voluntary family planning programs promoted by demographers and the Population Council. Beginning in the late 1960s, they enlisted new environmentalist and scientific allies in an effort to increase the intensity of the U.S. government's population control efforts both at home and abroad, alienating demographers in the process. The other population bomb drops. Environmental Malthusianism became a mass movement in the late 1960s, galvanized by two 1968 publications, both clearly influenced by Vaux and Osborne, a best-selling paperback by Stanford University biologist Paul Ehrlich, titled The Population Bomb, and a brief article titled The Tragedy of the Commons, published in Science by UC Santa Barbara biologist Garrett Hardin. Although these works are today remembered as the foundational text of environmental Malthusianism, they were in their time anything but original. Ulrich's Population Bomb wove together popular concerns about population growth, the ever-looming possibility of a nuclear world war, and the destruction of a natural environment. It claimed that the Earth was already overpopulated from an environmental perspective and that nothing could prevent widespread famine in the next decade. According to Ehrlich, only a massive dieback of people could avert imminent nuclear war. For that reason, he recommended that the United States cut off food aid to countries that were already beyond hope, including India and Egypt. Ehrlich also saw overpopulation in developing countries, attributing the social, economic, and environmental ills that had mounted in the United States across the previous decade, including the recent wave of urban uprisings, to domestic population growth. And we're doing this rhetoric right now. Like the war on terror, we're still feeling that. TikTok, I believe that could have had something to do with mass surveillance, and we're just working with China to get that done. Utah, we're doing they're doing the internet curfew for children, and China's doing that right now, actually. So, and that was a new thing that they were doing, even though they have mass surveillance on the population as well. I guess they have something extra. Okay. As was true of the environmental Malthusians who shaped his worldview, Ehrlich pointed to the world's challenges as indicators of overpopulation without any empirical evidence of causality. The claim he made for the effects of population growth were capacious enough that empirical evidence would have made it hard to come by, and without the epistemic space of the Malthusian population problematization, the ills themselves were the evidence. Malthus, 1789, had theorized that all of the world's problems stem from the pressure of population on natural resources, and had therefore viewed all of the world's problems as proof that human population was pressing on natural resources. Nearly 200 years later, Ehrlich made the same kind of claim to convince an audience that hadn't already accepted the Malthusian perspective. Ehrlich might have attempted to correlate population growth with environmental degradation, either cross-sectionally between locales or longitudinally within locales. He might have also carried out a simulation study, as Colin Hoover had done, to establish the relationship between population growth and economic development. He did none of these things. However, perhaps because questions of human population and the environment were far afield from his specialty in butterfly biology. The dude was definitely out of his league. Probably shouldn't quit his day job or get a hobby, you know, in the population studies. Oh my God. Instead, Ehrlich, 1968, simply asserted that the causal chain of deterioration is easily followed to its source. Too many cars, too many factories, too much detergent, too much pesticide, multiplying contrails, inadequate sewage treatment plants, too little water, too much carbon dioxide, all can be traced easily to too many people. Yet if Ehrlich had actually tried to trace the causal link to too many people, he might have found that what Barry Commoner did in 1971, namely that the increase in pollution in the United States as World War II had stemmed almost entirely from new production methods and rising per capita consumption rather than from population growth. In The Tragedy of the Commons, Hardin refuted Adam Smith's proposition that the emergent effect of individuals acting in their own interests would benefit society as a whole, arguing that the invisible hand of the market fails to effortlessly allocate resources held in common, such as air, water, and land. However, most of the article treats these environmental resources as a metaphor for the material resources Hardin argued were being unfairly transferred from the more or less deserving by the welfare state as a result of the excessive childbearing of the poor. Hardin, 1978, connected welfare to the natural environment with the unsustainable contention that the pollution problem is a consequence of population. As a solution to the tragedy of the commons, proposed governmental regulation of childbearing, which he described as mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon by the majority of peoples affected. Hardin's formulation elided the fact that such limits typically fall heaviest on the poor and non-white, though for him this was a feature rather than a bug. He favored governmental regulation of childbearing because he believed that poor women and women of color were least likely to use birth control on their own, and he feared that increase as a proportion of the world's population. Hardin thus cast the supposedly excessive existence of the world's poor as a threat to the very survival of the world's wealthy. All right, there's a lot to actually unpack there, and I was just like thinking about it in my head, but um, I believe what Margaret Sanger was doing was like technically against the poor and technically against African Americans, but black men didn't help by calling it black genocide because a lot of women wanted family planning at the same time that it was being forced upon the poor. Like a lot of black women specifically actually needed it, and they couldn't necessarily afford it. And even though that the Negro Project with Du Bois and Margaret Sanger, it sort of got reappropriated into white women using it for the most part. And this was always kind of the issue as we were using black bodies in the United States while still keeping tabs on how many black bodies there were that we wanted to breed, while uh, while halting white women from aborting. Like this was all happening at the same time, and the echo effect is still here now. All right. Where the hell was I? Oh, jeez. Oh, all right. Recent scholars have recognized the influence of Vaux and Osborne on Ulrich and Hardin, but less so that of Moore and Draper, just because of 1968 Moore and Draper had begun a new advertising campaign in American newspapers under the auspices of a new organization, the Population Crisis Committee. Moore and Draper had funded the PCC in response to the request from Ramir Ravenholt, director of the USAID's Office of Population, to generate public pressure to raise USAID's population control budget. Although they ultimately aimed to increase funding for overseas population control, Moore 1968 and Draper believed they could more effectively pike American concern by bringing the population problem home. They accomplished this by focusing their advertisements on population growth in the United States, pointing to social strife and environmental degradation as evidence that the U.S. population had surpassed its natural limit. Ehrlich's 1968 book borrowed more than its title from Moore's population bomb pamphlet. It also seamlessly combined the theme of Moore's pamphlet, which warned that continued population growth would inevitably lead to nuclear war, with those of Morris and Draper's PCC advertisements which blamed population growth for environmental degradation, rising crime rates, and social strife that threatened to tear the United States apart at the end of the 1960s. Moore, 1969, mailed Ulrich's book to his supporters with the letter stating that it expresses Moore's own view of the frightening prospects of the world population out of control. Hardin's contention that the production of the poor in the United States would drain public resources echoed an advertisement run by Moore and Draper in April 15, 1968, warning taxpayers that population growth would lead to rising tax rates in order to meet the ever-mounting costs of welfare, education, pollution control, conservation, and other services. Demographers and environmental Malthusians began to part ways with environmental Malthusians decided that the solution to the economic population problem, nominally voluntary family planning, would not solve the environmental population problem. Kingsley Davis made a presentation to the National Academy of Sciences, later published in Science, contending that population council's family planning programs were incapable of reducing population growth quickly enough to prevent ecological catastrophe. This presentation revived the slogan, "Zero Population Growth," to describe the goal of the environmental Malthusianism. It subsequently became the name of a grassroots organization led by Ulrich that pressed for explicit limits on childbearing worldwide. Beginning in the United States, Davis was the only prominent demographer to join its board. With the publication of Ulrich's Population Bomb and Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons and the simultaneous turn to domestic issues in the PCC's advertising campaign, most demographers felt that environmental Malthusianism had gone too far. Their problematization of population excluded the possibility that the United States was overpopulated and eschewed explicit claims on childbearing. Demographers and the Population Council defined such limits as coercive and warned that coercive measures to force contraceptive practice are more likely to bring down the government than the birth rate. They saw population growth as a threat to economic development and political stability in the global South, but viewed coercive population control as an even greater threat. Demographers initially spoke out against environmental Malthusianism and zero population growth, primarily against themselves, fearing that more public opposition would undermine the broader population movement. Princeton demographer Ansley Cole, 1968, president of PAA, devoted the presidential address to the question, should the United States start a campaign for fewer births? His answer was no, implicitly critiquing Ulrich's Population Bomb and PCC newspaper ad. Cole, 1968, complained that, quote, it has become fashionable to explain almost every national failure or shortcoming by rapid population growth. When the vast majority of the country's problems had little to do with population, he refuted Hardin's equation of population with pollution, pointing out that a population 1/2 or 3/4 of the size of the current one in the United States could ruin the potentiality or the potability of fresh water supplies and poison our atmosphere by unrestricted discharge of waste just as easily as could a larger one. Population control would not necessarily help the environment. Honestly, I do hear a lot of antenatal bias, and I do know it's just a individual choice thing, but honestly, I do kind of think that it's so complicated, and I wish people were more careful with their language from a pronatalist or antinatalist perspective. Honestly, what you say is said to a greater degree, and that just gets promoted into policy to harm other people, but that's not really anyone's problem. No one asked to be harming other people just because they have rights. It's not fair to blame women in the West for what they're doing. just because it's propaganda to harm the third world. Like, it'd be pretty sick to do that, honestly. All right. Where the hell was I? Okay. The 1970s PAA meeting featured a roundtable on ZPG where Notstein contested Ulrich and Harding's attribution of environmental degradation to population growth, demonstrating that increases in population had far outpaced increase in pollution outpaced increases in population. He called population control a distraction from an immediate attack on pollution by more direct means. Proponents of environmental Malthusianism often portray their critics as ideological opponents of birth control or as deniers of the environmental crisis. Cole and Notstein were neither. This is so true. So you're either trying to talk about birth control as not just a right, but something that harms other people through your rights. That makes it sound like you're trying to take away rights in the Western world. The same goes with trying to say that climate change is used for corrupt purposes. People will just say you're a climate denier, and unfortunately, like, I think the vast majority of people who want to talk about a certain important topic in bad faith are probably people trying to muddy the water. All right. Cole had been a student of Notstein at Princeton and had replaced Notstein as director of OPR when Notstein retired to head the Population Council. Both were committed to the promotion of family planning as a means of stimulating economic development in the Global South. Both men also favored environmental protection but preferred such economic solutions as cap-and-trade systems of pollutants. Even Ulrich viewed population control as an indirect approach to environmental protection. He had embraced it only after his earlier attempts to promote the regulation of pesticide use in U.S. agriculture failed. Ulrich's ZPG colleagues advocated for population control not because they perceived it as the most effective means of protecting the environment, but because they perceived it as the most effective means of staving off environmental degradation. The organization leaders explained that to the extent that we can protect the environment for future generations only at expense to the present of generation and material standards, government controls, and loss of freedom or dependence upon foreign sources of supply, we will choose less environmental protection. Wow. As had been the case for Birch, Vaux, Osborne, Moore, and Draper, the leaders of ZPG sought population control to protect their access to environmental resource, not to protect the environment itself. Demographers also contested Moore, Draper, Ulrich, Hardin's attribution of domestic social strife to population growth. University of Chicago demographer Philip Hauser, 1970, described the population explosion as a smokescreen to obscure other problems that should have priority, including the problems of the slums, racism, and the urban crisis in general. Demographer Conrad Tuber, who supervised the 1970 U.S. Census, agreed, announcing that economic and social factors are more important than population growth in threatening the quality of American life. The demographers of President Nixon's Commission on Population Growth and the American Future shared Hauser and Tuber's perspective. By the time the commission released its final report in 1972, the U.S. birth rate had fallen below replacement, and ZPG 1975 had turned its attention to immigration restriction as the most effective means of population control, reconnecting environmental Malthusianism with its interwar anti-immigration roots. Okay, so at the point of immigration, I don't know if this would be population control. Now it is connected because it's all a extrapolation. It's all like kind of like a Russian nest doll of events. Anyways, I would think of once the population comes to you, it just becomes eugenics. Because you're not going to them before they come to you. And we don't, even though that we say the third world will burst through their barriers and spread as communism into the Western worlds in Europe. That propaganda is out there, but I still think it's different. All right, I'll be back, guys.